and welcome back to ADHD Generations. Today we have a bit of a different episode because we actually have a guest with us and a plan. Now, this guest has been my mum's friend for 20 plus years, so I will pass it over to Mum to do the introductions.
Yes, we have a guest and a plan. It's amazing, like the preparation. So we, as you know, in previous podcasts, we've talked about having guests, and this is really the first time that we've done that. So we're all a bit, it's going to be fine. I'm absolutely sure. Alyson Jenkins, Dr. Alyson Jenkins, has been my friend for over 20 years. And we have talked about everything under the sun. And we thought it would be a wonderful opportunity to ask Alyson to come in and talk about CPTSD, which you may have heard of or you may not have heard of. Lewis, have you heard of it?
I have not heard. I've heard of it, but I don't know anything about it. So
Fair enough. So as we go along, if you want to ask any questions and if I want to ask any questions, I think that would be okay with you, Alyson.
Absolutely. It's my favourite topic, so please do.
Wonderful. So I guess the first thing we really want to know is, I'm going to be putting my glasses off and on. Sorry to get distracted. I'm going to get glasses, podcast, bit of paper. Today we'll be talking about CPTSD in relation to ADHD. And how it relates, how it overlaps, and those kinds of things. But obviously, two very separate conditions and two very different kind of backgrounds to those conditions. So, and Alyson is we're all really interested in how these two conditions kind of happen alongside each other. So I guess our first question is really, what is CPTSD?
Well, it's the term was coined in about 1994. I did my homework for this podcast, and we've all heard of PTSD, which is post-traumatic stress disorder. Well, complex PTSD is not PTSD, which PTSD is a result of one or a few major events: war, extreme violence, witnessing, an accident, being involved in an accident, that sort of thing. Whereas CPTSD is complex PTSD, and that is a sort of trauma that is experienced when you're very young, so usually between the ages of birth and 15, and it's repeated. And it can be all sorts of things, which we'll talk a bit more about later. It can be all sorts of things that create that trauma in the child and young person. And it can be called complex PTSD is what it's being called, but more recently people are calling it either childhood trauma or complex trauma, which makes it a bit simpler to talk about as well. So I might use all three things, but essentially they're the same thing. So we can
use the C as childhood or complex.
Yeah. Or, childhood or complex trauma. That's the best way of saying it. Yeah.
Okay, fab. Because I've seen it written and spoken about as CPTSD, but that's really hard to say as well. I'm not just from practical point of view, it's hard to say CPTSD over and over again. Yeah. So when you're saying CT, that is also exactly the same condition.
Yeah, and I'll call it complex trauma, or sometimes I'll call it childhood trauma, but essentially the same thing. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you.
So that's the term, and we can explore it now in the next few minutes. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. So complex trauma, I'm just going to go with that one for the moment, and ADHD. Okay. What are the traits, either the differences or the similarities, would you say?
Okay, well, I've been checking up on this overlap area. So I'll tell you first of all about how complex trauma. So do you want to talk about what it is first of all?
Yes. Go for it.
So what it is, as I said, is that drip or repeated trauma in childhood and it can be something like emotional neglect. Just that you're neglected as a child and in your development. It can be a sort of bullying, humiliation, witnessing violence, having violence perpetrated on you. So it's sort of abuse, but abuse covers a lot of things. And emotional neglect is as damaging, if sometimes not more damaging, than some of the more extreme and obvious abuses. So it covers a whole range of things that happen in childhood that really interrupt, your development. And what happens in trauma, anyone who knows anything about trauma, is you've got the freeze, fight or flight responses. And those responses will become really hardwired in you during those years in your childhood when you're experiencing that. So you have trauma responses, and they can be all sorts of ways that this shows up, and often, a lot of it, because one of the things about complex trauma is, especially if it's something, you can grow up in a family where it's really obvious, where there's, alcoholism, outright violence, and it's obvious then that you've grown up with certain dysfunction and abuse. Sometimes if it's just, that emotional neglect, being completely ignored as a child, or so that everything looks okay on the outside, but actually this child is suffering from abuse, that can be more difficult for it to come to light. But it does in adulthood, because you'll have all these things that you will have difficulty with. And I've got a list of them here. I hear it as, you can't, and you'll go, aha, when you'll see the overlap with ADHD. You
Okay.
can't relax. You're hypervigilant.
Yeah.
You catastrophize. You catastrophize a lot. Always think the worst. Usually have a bad self-image. You tend to isolate a lot, and you dissociate. You switch off. And both of those are because, it's that freeze response, but also you isolate because you find other human beings quite difficult to interact with. You often feel very empty with CPTSD, and that'll be often from the trauma when you're very young. You just have this sort of weird, you can't put your finger on it, sort of nebulous, empty feeling, desolate. You'll have emotional dysregulation. Nearly everyone with CPTSD will have that. Often self-harm and addiction goes alongside CPTSD, alongside complex trauma. You're often a workaholic, and you self-sabotage usually. Things will be going very well for you, and then you will sabotage everything. So those are some of the most obvious. There are more, but those are the most obvious ones. And of course, people with complex trauma won't have all of them, or maybe they will. You often don't feel safe, so you're overcompensating in lots of ways with that, with hypervigilance. So that's how it shows up. And one of the other things that we have, people with complex trauma, because you might have guessed I have it, that's why I'm so interested and like finding out about it, is that you have this thing that called toxic shame. It's not shame about anything in particular. You just feel shame for being you. And there are levels of that and intensities, as with all those things that show up. And we do call them symptoms in complex trauma because there's a cause, and these are showing up as a result of those causes. And people with CPTSD procrastinate a lot and have damaged self-identity as well. So as you can see, you're nodding away there because there's going to be loads of overlap that you can.
So much overlap. Oh my God.
I know, and you can see why people might be diagnosed with one thing or the other, and you can see why people might have both because of the childhoods that can be very, very difficult for ADHD kids, could be also then traumatized and have both sets of traits / symptoms all in one go.
Exactly. And it's not that not everyone with ADHD has complex trauma, and not everyone with complex trauma has ADHD.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of overlap. And, that makes it very interesting. And everything I've found, there's no hard and fast sort of diagnosis. There's no hard and fast evidence as to all of this. But it really is, for me, it's identifying, what happens with you as an individual, what's going on with you, and how can you not just manage it or understand your or get strategies, but how sometimes you can actually, heal in complex trauma. We talk about healing and recovering as well as managing and getting strategies to cope with it all, which comes first, I suppose. So those symptoms all seem quite familiar to you then.
Very much so.
I mean, a lot of it's about the emotional symptoms and traits, I guess. The emotional dysregulation, which is a huge trait for people with ADHD. But some of the other things you mentioned, like substance use and various kinds of difficulties, self-injury, self-harm, those kinds of things that you were talking about, can fall absolutely into both camps, and people with ADHD really can struggle with those things.
Yeah.
So I remember when we were chatting, and I don't know about the self-injury thing, Alison. I remember us talking about that because some people struggle a lot with biting their nails or skin picking and things like that, which is quite common in ADHD. And I think you were saying it's quite common in CT as well.
Well, what I've noticed, because I trained as to do ADHD coaching with UEST quite recently, and I've
Yes, you
since
did.
been coaching some people with ADHD, and I've noticed that as it is something that shows up, isn't it? Quite extreme sometimes as well. The nail biting, picking, hair thing. And yes, just constant. I haven't noticed it as much in people with complex trauma, to be honest. They tend to be more self-harm. They tend to be more out and out self-harmers in my experience. Yeah. Yes. And I don't know about addiction in people with ADHD. I know that a lot of people with complex trauma have a struggle with addiction as an escape, something to help them relax and escape.
No, it's the same. It's the same with ADHD. A lot of people talk about addiction with ADHD as well, and we know that a greater number in the prison population, for example, have ADHD. So there's substance use, addictions, kind of drugs, criminal activities to pay for drugs, and this kind of cycle of getting sucked down into the criminal justice system because of. And you can kind of see that the overlap there between trauma, ADHD, and getting into trouble with the law and substance use and stuff like that.
Yeah, because it's a bit of a chicken and egg situation at a lot of the time, isn't it? As to which came first, and then, as you say, the cycle thing, and then it becomes intergenerational as well, which is something I've just started to become more interested in. There's a new book just out actually about breaking the cycle, which talks about ADHD and complex trauma, and how life is difficult for people with those. It just is can be very different.
Can you remember the name of the book by any chance? If not, we could put it in a link underneath if people are interested.
Yeah.
It's actually called Breaking the Cycle. I can't remember the name of the author at the moment, but it's recently come out, very recently. She's American, and it's become a bestseller almost overnight, because I think we're all starting to recognise this thing now about the intergenerational traits and behaviours. And we all want to break the cycle, but it's not always easy, is it? It's really difficult sometimes.
Breaking cycles is just such a massive challenge. It requires so much energy and power, and also support, and not being on your own and not having to try it and do everything on your own. And that is just really tough. Really, really tough.
Yeah, and that's an important thing, Est, about this being on your own, because people with complex trauma, especially people who haven't had, like I said, that big trauma or obvious one, often think, oh, it was all right. I was fed and clothed and I wasn't beaten or sexually abused. And they'll brush it under the carpet, for so long. And it takes other people to help us identify it. And it takes other people to support us as we, get better then and deal with it. We absolutely need community. In addiction circles, I've heard it say quite often that the opposite of addiction is connection. because we'll often avoid connection with complex trauma. We'll avoid it because it's too difficult. But actually, that's what we need more than anything, is that connection and support.
I wonder if there's a bit of a link there, with rejection sensitivity dysphoria, and that idea that where some people really struggle to make connections because they're so worried about being rejected, they'd rather not make the connection in the first place. There's a little bit of an overlap there as well, I think.
Yeah, there is, because people with complex trauma are, super sensitive, and I've heard you talk a lot about this. What's it called? Rejection sensitivity dysphoria. Is that right?
Yeah,
Is that right?
yeah,
Got it
that's
right
right.
that time. Yeah. Yeah. So you said people with ADHD have that big time.
Usually,
And,
yeah,
Yeah.
90%.
Yeah. I'm yet to meet someone with ADHD who doesn't have it.
Yeah,
I'm not going to lie.
same. I have never met anyone who doesn't have it. Yeah, and it's very, very difficult thing to live with. I think RSD is probably the thing that a lot of people bring to coaching. A lot of people, it's the thing that kind of, it makes the difference between, it's not a superpower. I don't think it is one, but some people would say that's a huge downside of having ADHD is the RSD and the emotional dysregulation as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, awful, because it keeps us isolated,
Yeah,
stops us connecting, and also you're always living with fear, which is so bad for you. Not just emotionally and interpersonally, but physically. Fear
Yeah.
makes us ill. So it's just, yeah. So as much support as people can get, the better.
Yeah. Absolutely.
and the shame as well. You mentioned the shame earlier on, and that's another overlap with ADHD. A lot of people have a lot of shame about a lot of things, and that could also be a thing that stops you from reaching out.
Yeah,
absolutely. Oh yes, that's part of that. That's another reason why people isolate, is because they're full of shame and guilt. And a lot of people will feel bad about stuff that actually happened to them, not because of they and it's very nebulous with a lot of people, because it happened when you were young. You don't have the vocabulary or the emotional vocabulary either to understand what happened to you. So you actually don't know how to talk about it or to express it, And it's when you're adult and then things start all going to pieces, you still don't have the vocabulary to talk about it really. But, again, that is why we need other people that can help us, or people who've already started along a sort of recovery or understanding themselves, to help them identify and work with what they've got. And one of the reasons I like coaching, or I went down the coaching route other than therapy, is this thing about, that starting thing with, getting to know yourself, and just knowing what's going on with you, and moving from there, rather than looking back at what all the past. It's like, what's going on with me now, and how is it all this showing up? And you only need, as you said, you only need to think about a few of the traits and symptoms to go, oh, that's not quite right. I don't want that, or I want to manage that better, or whatever it is, And some people, like myself, I had to really fall to bits a couple of times before I thought, got to do something about this. And it's best if people don't go, there. So it's great that there is so much community now. And I know, West, you've developed a community in Swansea around ADHD, which is amazing, because people can, feel part of a community and supported there, which is, I think is essential to getting
Absolutely.
better.
And there were so many overlaps there with the things that you were saying, something there around everything has to fall apart for you to realize that there's something going on. That's an overlap with ADHD as well. And sometimes when people have some kind of crisis, or when some people hit menopause, there are various times in somebody's life. Some people report that when they're fine in school and then they go to university and it all falls apart, or their career takes off and it all falls apart. There are just these kind of times in life. I remember when Lewis, really the panic attack that you had when you were 14, that was the crunch point where we found out what was really going on with you. So it's kind of like a crisis, really, isn't it? Some kind of crisis.
Yeah, I still don't really know what that panic attack was about. I was watching Scrubs.
Yeah,
I'm not really sure why it came on. Still haven't really delved into it, but I'm sure I'll find out eventually.
Do you know, I'm very pleased that you did have that panic attack.
Yeah, sometimes there isn't one cause to it. It's just stuff that builds up or builds up, and sometimes it just comes out, like you said, when you're watching Scrubs. It doesn't really matter. It's but you're so right. It will show up somehow, and there are triggers, as you said, Est. For me, it was one of the ones was menopause as well. I got really ill around that time. I was stressed with my work. I had menopause. I had this immune system crash, and I'd been in recovery for quite a few years then. But my immune system took this huge crash, and I thought, things don't go in straight lines, do they? I'd been getting well, and I'd been on a nice plateau for quite a few years. And then all of a sudden there was this dip, and then I had to go, oh my God, I need to do something else. And that was when I discovered my body, I suppose. And there's a lot of stuff out there now about embodiment and somatic coaching, somatic work, and embodiment. And it was, back in 2010, I started to realize that I was just living up here. I was just living in my head completely. And I was so dissociated from my body. And since then, and more recently as well, working with clients, I realized, oh my God, it's not with everybody, but with a lot of people with complex trauma and ADHD I've seen, they're quite dissociated from their bodies. And that is one path of healing, understanding, and dealing with your traits that is, I think has got a long way to go to be explored. And for me as well, I started meditation back then to calm my head. And I also took up Tai Chi. And believe it or not, my Tai Chi teacher was called Dai Tai Chi. And in the first...
Because we are in Wales.
Yeah.
Of course. And in the first session, I was very uncoordinated. And he just looked me in the eye and said, Alyson, welcome to your body. And it really was, and it was like that for me. I started to realize that I'm not all up here. I think therefore I am was a load of nonsense, really, because, it's only a part of who we are. We are thinking and feeling, and we're bodies, and, the heart-gut thing is we're actually getting more evidence for, all of us, our whole being, isn't it now? It's not, but I lived so much up here. I thought I could think my way out of anything. It's ridiculous.
Yeah.
I know. Yeah, I must have. I've got to say, I've never been particularly in touch with my physical being.
No.
It's just kind of, I feel like quite a lot of the time that this is me up here, and the rest of it's just kind of walking around and me sitting on top almost, and it's not great. So breathing, and you've shown me some breathing techniques before, Alyson, and with you, I think Alyson showed you breathing techniques before as well, and somebody showed me box breathing recently as well, and just breathing and getting breath in and back out again can be a way of just
grounding you,
being inside.
Absolutely, and it calms our nervous system, because I've become very keen on finding out about nervous systems recently. It's the geeky side of me, I just can't. I get excited about the parasympathetic nervous system and the vagus nerve.
As
now,
you do,
yeah, you do. And this thing, that we're not able to relax. People with ADHD and complex trauma find it very difficult to relax. I had in 2010 when I was in, it was like, must relax harder. Just can't seem to, I just didn't know how. I didn't know how, really. I had to learn. And that sounds strange to someone who hasn't got complex trauma or ADHD. It sounds odd that you have to learn how to relax. But it's really important that we do. And this breathing thing is part of that, isn't it? Just kicks our parasympathetic nervous system in. Because especially with trauma, you've had, it's been your reptilian brain on survival alert the whole time. And learning then to actually, that deadline isn't life-threatening. I can survive this. Calm down so I can think. Or because, if you're in a panic, you just can't think straight. I mean, that one. So learning to relax was with me at that time when I got ill, and was major. Going to Tai Chi and the breathing and getting into my body. And I recently, working with an ADHD client, I asked her to do a bit of ordinary breathing, box breathing, triangular breathing. I said, choose which one you like the best. She did 2 breaths and said, oh, this is so uncomfortable. Honestly, really, really. It's an interesting one.
It was really interesting what you said about that whole idea of diagnosis and then relearning how to almost live. And a lot of people with ADHD say that when you get a diagnosis, it's almost like you've been given the manual, that you've been driving the car or taking the journey all this time with no manual and no map. And then when you get a diagnosis, you've got a manual and a map, and you can work out, what to do and how to do it. Would you say that was a crossover there with CT?
Oh, definitely. I love that metaphor, Esther, the driving manual and the map. Yeah, it's a really good way of thinking about it and seeing it. And yeah, absolutely. Because I always thought I had a few light bulb moments, like when I got ill in 2010, but I had one as well back in about 1990. I don't know. I was in my late 30s, and I had a light bulb moment then when I realized that I had that a lot of my life crises had been to do with complex trauma. And then since then, slowly, I started to, listen to people, talk to people. And as you say, you get a bit of a map then, don't you? As to what to do, where to go, how to do it. And you don't feel as if, oh my God, it was just me. You feel, oh yeah, okay, lots of other people have this as well and are like me. And yeah, so there are those light bulb moments. And as you say, when you have your diagnosis in ADHD, it must be great that, again, you don't feel alone. And you've got, there you are. There's my traits, and this is what I can do about it. And I can, it's really, again, it's other people, isn't it? So, yeah.
Yeah, that's true. And just to interject there, that it's like not necessary to have a diagnosis. A lot of people self-diagnose, and that's good enough, really. Yeah. Especially nowadays when it's now impossible to get to see anyone to even get a diagnosis. But yeah, self-diagnosis or realization that you're likely to have the condition, any of those things can suddenly open up this whole roadmap that you have, that you can then start to get information and share, and hopefully will enable people to reach out to others, knowing that they're not broken and it's not their fault, and it is actually a thing. Yeah, they have a thing.
Absolutely.
Did you feel like that when you got diagnosed? You felt a bit more like that.
I was 14, so I didn't really quite comprehend exactly the ramifications of the disorder. You can't say disorder anymore, can you?
Condition.
Thank you. Sorry. But yeah, no, I think I learned a lot more about it from a later age, and that was kind of my light bulb moment. It wasn't when I got diagnosed; it was when you hyper focused on it and told me all about it. So, yeah, that was my experience with learning about my condition, I suppose.
So I just want to ask you about meditation, because one of the things that we've both got in common, and one of the things that kind of we've talked about a lot over the years, I guess, is meditation. And you've mentioned parasympathetic things a moment ago, and you've mentioned various kind of the nervous system, which you're really interested in. And I know that a lot of people with ADHD would think to themselves, God, it's really hard to meditate for all the reasons that you've talked about: hyperactivity, racing thoughts, busy body, and all of those things. Can you tell us a little bit more about meditation and how you approach it?
Oh, yeah. Well, what I did first of all, in that moment of panic back in 2010 when I was ill, said, I've got to do something about this. So I booked myself on a 5-day silent retreat immediately, having done it was, the first few days were quite painful. It was, for all sorts of reasons. Not so much for me, the sitting still, because I can do that, but your own thoughts. There I was, and as my meditation teacher on that said, he said, "What happens, you see, in meditation is quite simple. You just meet yourself over and over again." I thought, oh yeah, okay. And so what I did after that sort of Buddhist boot camp, as I call it, after I came back, I did start a very focused meditation practice, regular every day. And it's not easy in the beginning, because you do meet yourself every day. There's your to-do list, there's your neuroses, there's your blah, 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 going on and on and on and on. And it's not something very pleasant, but eventually, either you get bored of your own thoughts, or like I like, which I did. I just got bored with it sometimes. Oh, here we go again, yak, yak, yak. But what happens as well? I like to think of it like I had this very jagged, big sort of stuff going on, loud, painful. And eventually, it hasn't gone by any means, but now it's more like a little, and it is like a bit of a Zen symbol, that soft pebble, so now I've got like a little soft pebble that I can carry around with me, I don't have this huge, like out of tune brass band in my head anymore, constantly annoying me and driving me mad. But so what I do now, I've had phases over the last 13 years. Sometimes I do it regularly, sometimes I don't. But I do hear people say a lot, I can't do it, I can't do that. I can't sit and meditate. Well, everybody can, because it doesn't mean that you have to not think. That's not really the goal, because people say, I've got to not think, I've got to empty my head. No. Again, like the meditation teacher in that first retreat said, just get your arse on the cushion every day and everything else will follow. And he said,
Arse on the
everything else
cushion
will follow.
I love it.
That's it. That's what he said. And he said, just do it every day. And what I say to people is, just start with 5 minutes. Start with 2 minutes. Yeah. If it's so painful for you in the beginning, set your clock, 2 minutes. You can do that. You can do that. You can build up to 5.
There's an app with very nice tingy bells on it called Insight Timer. And you can set any number of minutes on that, and it just goes ting at the end. And there are lots of guided meditations as well. And that whole thing about breathing, where we started with the whole thing about breathing. I don't know about you, Lewis. Have you ever tried feeling your breath and paying attention to it as it's?
Not particularly, I'm going to be honest. I'm probably still in the stage of the brass band in my head. I'm not going to lie.
Fair enough.
But the only breathing techniques I do are obviously the corner. Box breathing, is that what it's called?
Box breathing is when you breathe in for a certain number, hold for a certain number, and then breathe out. So my therapist taught me breathe in for 4, hold for 7, breathe out for 8. So I don't know if it's the same one as you.
Oh, right. That's a relaxing breath for me, that one. Yeah. That's a breath that really relaxes you. But there's the box breath. In for 4, hold for 4, out for 4, hold for 4.
Yeah.
Or you can do triangular, which is in for 4, hold for 4, out for 4, in for 4, out for 4,
Right.
you know. Or
Yeah.
I'd stick with one that you're comfortable with, really. One that you like,
Yeah.
you know, that is easy for you. I mean,
Mm.
always start easy and start small. It's
Yeah.
basically it. You know, start easy, start small. And, you know, and when you, um, meditate to start, you know, it's just notice your breath, just be in your body. And one of the things I do is body scans. So just start feeling your body all the way down, all the way up, all the way down. Notice where you've got tension. You know, and there's another one. I will mention her. She's called the Crappy Childhood Fairy on YouTube. And she is amazing. And what she does is you meditate and you just choose a word like peace or love or something positive, and you just repeat the word. And that is something that, you know, can help people. And the guided ones, as you say, yes, whatever works with you. But and you'll just observe your thoughts, and you know, eventually, if you're determined, like I can be, you know, you do it regularly, it'll happen slowly, bit
Mm.
by bit. You know, there's not going to be a big thing, and some people have that thing. I have seen people who can, you know, do it like that, but most people,
Amazing.
it just, you know, small steps, slowly, bit by
Yeah.
bit.
Baby
Yeah,
steps.
and
Yeah.
it's been important. Yeah, it's been important to me, that meditation has been very important in my recovery, and I always, advocate it. Yeah, definitely. What about you
Yeah.
two? You haven't tried it, Lewis. What about you, Est?
Oh yeah, I've tried. I've been, I've known about and practice off and on meditation for about 20 years, but probably the amount of time that I've known you, really, although it was a coincidence. But I do find it difficult, but I also find that not only sitting and breathing, but also doing things mindfully as well is quite helpful. So walking maybe, or doing a repetitive task perhaps mindfully. It's hard, really hard, when your brain's going at 50 miles an hour, but then being aware that that's happening and then trying to bring your attention back to the thing that you're doing, that can be so mindfulness as well as meditation, I guess, a combination of all of those things, really.
Yeah, good point. I was just thinking about Yeah, good points about mindfulness, Est. Yeah, it's so important. And you could just choose one task, like washing the dishes, and you tell
Mm.
yourself, "I'm going to wash the dishes mindfully every day," and just do that. It make a difference. It will. Yeah.
I guess that loops back round to the breathing, doesn't it? Because when you're sitting and if you're focusing on the breathing, you're mindfully breathing almost, which means that
Exactly.
it's a
Yeah, and
little bit easier to not have the thoughts, which do come, but they can also then go again.
that's right. You just keep coming back to your breath. It can be like a bit like a tightrope in the beginning. That's how I experienced it. It was, oh, there I go again. Oh, back on, back off, back on, back off, back on. Honest, all the time.
Yeah.
Thoughts, oh, breath, thoughts, breath, blah, blah, blah. Until gradually you can do a few, 2 or 3 breaths at a time. Woohoo! You know, and then maybe a few more. And then eventually, you know, you will get that, you know, you think less and less, or you come back more than, you know, just like that. Yeah. So, yeah, for me, and you know, when you do that, then your parasympathetic nervous system kicks in to help you relax, which is really good for everything. It's good for your body, you know, because if we're always on fight or flight and in the head, you know, we're much more prone to physical illnesses and inflammation and stress, and, you know, I mean, yeah, and on and on. So not
Absolutely.
only is it good for us emotionally, it's good for us physically as well to do that.
So
Yeah.
we've looked at some really interesting aspects of the overlap of these two conditions.
Mm.
We've looked at the impacts it can have on us. We've looked at we've had some ideas from you around meditation, and I think it's fair to say stemming from a kind of Buddhist practice philosophy, which you've been interested in, I know, for many years, and likewise.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. I know the meditation, you don't have to be a Buddhist or anything
No.
to do meditation or be mindful. But for me, some of the philosophy around Buddhism is really, really important. And also, I'm in a 12-step recovery program as well, which has so much overlap with Buddhism, funnily enough. And this thing about, we accept life on life's terms. It's sort of very basic, this thing that acceptance, and accepting the word, I don't find that it has bad connotations for me, but it's the word suffering, that we all do suffer, all of us suffer. And it's about acknowledging, oh God, yeah, life's hard, I'm struggling. And then accepting that suffering and accepting, well, everything really as it is, because we can't control other people. We can't control we can't control the circumstances in our life. So learning then to bring that focus in on what we can control, which is pretty much ourselves.
Yeah.
And,
Exactly.
and so that Buddhist and recovery program overlap there about acceptance and leaving go of this need of controlling, which we do have. We all have it. I have to check myself all the time, especially with my family. I want to control them, but it doesn't work. It doesn't work. So, and I still, and I think maybe we just Esther and I, we come from a lifelong learning background. It's just a big learning thing all the time. I have to bring myself
Never stop
back.
learning.
No, and even in the day, I go, oh, Alyson, you've done it again. Come back, stop that. Be mindful. Stop trying to control that. On a daily basis. So that's how it is. And
So helpful.
yeah.
So tell us a
Yeah.
little bit more about recovery, because you're a recovery coach, and
I am a recovery coach.
We'll pop a link to your website down in the comments underneath.
Hopefully the editor can maybe edit in a link.
Yeah,
here for
thank
us.
you,
That'd be
editor.
great. Yeah, cheers.
But you'll be interested to go and have a look at Alyson's website. We've talked a little bit about adult learning. Tell us a little bit more about recovery. Now, obviously, you can't recover from ADHD. It's a thing. It's always there. But you can recover from some of the things that ADHD causes in our lives, things like substance use or addiction, those kinds of things. And when it comes to CT, is it my understanding that you can recover from complex trauma?
Yes. I mean, and when I say recovery, or when people talk about recovery, it's not that you're going to just be, woohoo, I'm recovered. It's an ongoing thing. Like I said, on a daily basis, I'm always having to check myself. So it's not that you recover, but you're always, but you can gain a life that is probably better than you ever imagined. By healing. So we call it healing in recovery, but it's also managing symptoms. It's also developing strategies, which often come before the sort of healing thing. And I know in ADHD you don't talk about healing as such, but there's so much overlap, I think, in the ways, like the small steps, developing strategies that can, that recovery can help with, as you say, ADHD, particularly if people are self-sabotaging, or turn into substances, addictions, compulsive behaviours, that sort of thing. There's overlap with addiction, that sort of thing. So the way that recovery goes is that it's small steps. And involves the embodiment, the mindfulness, the getting to know yourself. Probably the same with ADHD coaching to a large extent, would you say, Est?
Yeah, ADHD coaching, a lot of what we do with our clients, and I also think ADHD counselling should be a thing so that people can come to terms with their pasts as well as their futures. But to come back to it, ADHD coaching is a lot about understanding yourself, listening to the messages that you're telling yourself, understanding why you're doing things and what you're saying to yourself about why you're doing things, and thinking about, are those things helpful to me? Are they not? And if they're not, how can we change them? And how can we change the things that we tell ourselves and the messages that we give ourselves? So all of
Oh,
that sounds very, very similar.
so, and that reminds me of things that I really wanted to say in our conversation is inner child work. So, in complex trauma, you do this inner child stuff, which is, again, it's a whole 2-hour chat about that. Could be on, that is a big area. But then there's this thing about self-compassion. People with complex trauma, and in my experience, people with ADHD, hard on themselves,
Oh
really hard on
yeah.
themselves.
Absolutely.
Because they think it's their fault, they try to
Oh.
overcompensate, they fall short, beat themselves up. And it's a constant beating yourself up, isn't it? So self-compassion is, I would say, it is one of the most important things. I'm so glad you mentioned those things which triggered me to think of that, Est, because it's probably one of the things that, the bottom line, learn to have some self-compassion. And for people who don't have these conditions, that, for example, the Dalai Lama, when he first started to talk to people in the West, when they talked about self-compassion, he sort of went, pardon? You need to develop this. It's an alien thing. Well, surely that's norm, because he found it difficult to that the people in the West would beat themselves up and need to develop self-compassion. Whereas, we, and I know now that it is pretty fundamental to people with complex trauma, and I imagine with people with ADHD. I saw you both going, yes. Would you agree there? Yeah.
So many people come to coaching, don't they, with such negative and unhelpful beliefs about themselves and low self-esteem, and just, I'm too much, I'm too loud, I'm too noisy, I'm too lazy, I'm too disorganized, just all of it. And it's heartbreaking, actually, because you just want to reach out to that person and give them a huge hug and say, be lovely to yourself because you're lovely, And part of what I do in my ADHD coaching is helping people to see what's going on there. Did you have anything you wanted to say about that?
I mean, I can only talk from my own personal experience at this point, if I'm honest. But, I think the coaching that I'm having is helping me to, take away the words like lazy and disorganized, and because I am actually not lazy anymore. Well, I'm kind of lazy, but in a good way.
That's resting. That's called resting.
Yeah. And this turned around one day, and it just turned out I wasn't disorganized anymore. I've got a diary. I've got a laptop with all my files organized for uni, and I've got a calendar, and it's just, I would have never even comprehended that idea before.
Lewis, you organise all the podcasts, don't you? You make sure it all happens.
Yeah, well done, Lewis. Well done. And wrote that label. Yeah, well done. That's amazing. And so many of us need to be proud of ourselves for just surviving, let alone, doing all these amazing things that we're doing. Honestly, it's when we have these beliefs about ourselves that we've been carting around all our lives, it's so self-destructive and so stops us being who we have the potential to be. So many people. It's sad to think that it's taken until very recently for all these conversations to happen, for people to feel okay about talking about, their addictions, their hang-ups, their crazy beliefs. It's so good that people are talking about this. and being more open about it, because it's not your fault is usually what, because we just think it's our fault somehow that we're like we are, and and it's
Yeah,
not.
and
It's really not. And you
shame,
were saying you
shame
want
and
to hug,
blame.
yeah, and you want to hug
Yeah,
people, but the trick
yeah.
is to get people to hug themselves, isn't it? And again,
Yeah.
it's
Yes,
small steps. It's
I
small
often end
steps.
conversations like this nowadays. I don't know when I started doing it, but I've just started. I'm sending virtual hugs out to sort of people whenever I'm
Yeah.
having
Oh, it's that emoji,
conversations with them.
isn't it? Emoji
It is,
thing. Yeah. And
we just want to hug
but
everyone.
it's, because I was in therapy for quite a few years, and when she said to me, you have to go home and be nice to yourself, I was like, what's that about? And and she asked me, don't you get pleasure from walking on a beach and feeling the sand between your toes? And I was like, nah, I don't get that. But that's complex trauma. We really don't. Sensation and pleasure and stuff is a thing, but that's something else. But she said, right, what I'd like you to do is choose a part of your body. I said, on my shoulder. And she said, well, go home and stroke your shoulder every night. And that sounds a bit crazy, but it was like a massive thing for me, because I had to pretend that I was stroking somebody that I loved. Oh, I can feel it now. And
Oh,
Oh.
yeah, and it was that thing, that so many people they don't have that compassion for themselves. And so developing
you
it,
you shared that with
carry
me
on.
before, Alison, and I have passed that on to other people who I've coached, and it's such a lovely thing. I've asked people to go to choose a part of their body that they like, even if they don't love, they just like, and then to go away and just practice really appreciating that part of themselves that they like. And I've had some nice feedback about that, but it does feel kind of really difficult for some people who really can't find anything to like about themselves.
Oh, absolutely. It is difficult, but small steps.
Small step.
I know I've repeated that a few times in this chat, but a bit at a time, and you'll get there. Keep going, keep going. Yeah, and in a recovery journey then is very much about that. Day at a time, step at a time. Keep going. It is yeah, but loving yourself. Oh, loving yourself sounded awful to me. Going back a few years, sounded grated with me. But self-compassion sounds a little bit more, a bit easier in a way, because we have compassion for others, but it has to start with us, really. It really
I've tried
does need to start.
self-appreciation as well, asking people to appreciate
Yeah,
themselves. I've said to people before, if you can't like yourself and you can't love yourself, at least let's work on appreciating yourself. And that's a start.
yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
Yes, and I know, West, you like looking at people's strengths, because I do these
Yeah.
classes in the community as well, and we start off, okay, what are your good points, and the number of people who go, I can't say, I don't know, I haven't got any,
Oh,
and
bless.
it takes a while for people to realize, actually, do you know, I get 3 kids up in the morning, I get them to school, I clothe them, you know, wow, that's a big thing. We've all got these strengths, but we all go, oh no, I'm not good at anything, and it takes a while for us to realize, what we are good at a lot of things, and we are good, and people with ADHD and complex trauma have that added layer on. And those are people who haven't got maybe these conditions, so
Yeah.
we've got that added layer. So, oh, it's hard work, but it's worth it. And that's the other message is about hope. A
Yeah.
lot of
Yeah.
hopefulness and positivity that, all this work and effort that you put into, developing strategies and getting to understand your condition and stuff, it's all worth it, because,
Yeah.
like in recovery, we say, And I used to grate on me when I heard this. There is a life beyond your wildest dreams. I used to go, oh, for goodness sake, I was so cynical about it. But my life might not look much different on the outside, but inside, I do have a life beyond my wildest dreams. I get the truth of that now. If you keep going and keep doing it, you can have a life beyond your wildest dreams. In recovery and with ADHD, you just, just keep doing the stuff that's suggested to you and that is good for you. And you can change hugely.
Absolutely.
What do you
That
think
is
about
such a
hope?
beautiful way. I was going to say that is such a lovely, beautiful kind of way to kind of round up really the session, because we've talked about how both conditions can be really that people can struggle so much with both these conditions, the kinds of times when people might discover their conditions, what might happen when we've been diagnosed, and also various different approaches and different kind of ways that we might think about either strategizing or recovery, or both, depending on which bits of what's going on there. But all in all, it ends up with this, with the hope, and the knowledge that if we can reach out, we can try different things, and we can live this life beyond our wildest dreams that you talked about, which is so touching and so lovely. So is there anything else that you'd like to add before we wrap up our podcast?
Oh, Est, I could just talk about this for hours and hours. I've missed out so much, I've just gone, I didn't talk about that, and I didn't talk about that. But I think we've covered quite a lot, haven't we? I think. Is there something?
We can always do a part two. We can always do a part two.
Yeah, we could. Because one of the things I found interesting was those those points in your life where you have crises and you start to think, I've got to change, or there's these big points in your life like menopause, divorce, changing schools, or whatever it is. It's quite interesting things to think about, those transition times in our lives. But anyway, I think we've covered loads and loads. I haven't got anything, that I want to add today. So is there anything what you want to ask, or
what I would say is, if anyone watching this video has any questions or any comments, please do put them in the comments down below. And we keep an eye on all our comments, so we will get back to you, and we can, if anyone has questions, we can ask Alyson, and then we'll respond to you. And then if people would like a part 2 on complex post-traumatic stress disorder, or anything around that and its relationship with ADHD, let us know, and we can invite Alyson back and we can do it all over again.
Absolutely.
That'd be great.
Anything from you,
Thank
Lou?
you,
no, that's it from me. I've really enjoyed it. It's really interesting hearing about it, to be honest.
Much. Yes, thank you so much. We really appreciate your time, and thank you for being so open and sharing so much with us and anyone who's watching.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you both for the chance, because like I said, it is my favourite subject. So I have really, really enjoyed talking to you both. And I love the way that, your experience with ADHD informs me, and, that's great too.
Oh, thank you, Alyson. Lots of love. Okay. We'll see you soon.
Yeah. Bye.
Bye.
Bye both.